Have you ever wondered if one landscape could force humanity to become something entirely different? Before cities, before writing, before empires, there was a world where lakes vanished, grasslands died, and entire human communities had to learn how to survive a land that was slowly turning against them. This was not a sudden disaster, but a transformation so long and unforgiving that it changed the way humans moved, planned, remembered, and lived. If you enjoy deep history, ancient mysteries, and lost worlds, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's step into the desert that changed humanity forever. At first, it does not look like the kind of place that could change the human story. It looks empty. It looks finished. The horizon trembles in heat. The ground breaks into old plates of clay and stone, and wind moves over the surface as if it is searching for something that is no longer there. Sand creeps across buried shorelines. Dry valleys cut through rock that has not seen running water in ages. In some places, there are skeletons of lakes so vast they once reflected whole skies, and now they survive only as pale mineral scars. In others, there are scattered tools, abandoned campsites, fish bones far from any modern river, and the faint outlines of lives that seem to belong to a different planet. But this is not another planet. This is a desert, and beneath its silence lies one of the longest, hardest turning points humans ever endured. What makes this landscape so unsettling is not only its harshness, but its memory. The desert is full of evidence that it used to be something else. It keeps the shape of vanished water. It keeps the roots of migrating animals that no longer come. It keeps traces of people who stayed as long as they could, adapting step by step as the world around them tightened. Then, eventually, many of them moved, or changed, or disappeared into new ways of living so completely that later generations would never know how much had been lost in the transition. The desert did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It advanced by degrees, quietly enough that no one living through the early stages could have seen the full pattern. A pool dries a little earlier each year. Grass returns later. Herds hesitate, then alter their routes. Familiar places become dangerous. Distances lengthen. Memory becomes more important than abundance. Survival becomes less about thriving in a rich landscape and more about staying one move ahead of absence. Long before cities, before writing, before kings tried to turn rivers into borders and empires into permanent things, human beings were already being trained by places like this, not trained in comfort and not trained kindly. A growing desert does not negotiate. It does not care which group knows the oldest paths, which family once controlled the best ground, or which season used to be dependable. It strips away assumptions one by one. It punishes delay. It exposes weakness in routines that worked for centuries. It turns local knowledge into the most valuable thing a person can carry. And in doing so, it forces changes that go deeper than movement alone. It changes how people travel, how they store resources, how they teach children, how they remember landscapes, how they form alliances, how they read the sky, how far ahead they plan, and perhaps even how they think about themselves in relation to time. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. It is tempting to imagine ancient people as passive victims of climate, standing helpless while the world closes around them. The record suggests something far more complicated. They are alert, inventive, stubborn, and mobile. They do not simply wait to be defeated. They test new routes. They return to old waterholes. They split into smaller groups, rejoin larger ones, follow herds, abandon favoured camps, and carry skills across enormous distances. They survive with an intensity that is difficult to picture from a modern chair in a climate-controlled room. But there are limits to ingenuity, especially when the change is not a single disaster, but a long rearrangement of the earth itself. A flood can be fled, a fire can pass, a storm can end. A desert that expands over generations is different. It teaches through repetition. Its lesson is the same every year, only harsher. There is less water than before. There is less certainty than before. The world your parents knew is already partly gone. This is why deserts matter so much in the deeper history of our species, not because they are empty, but because they become selective. They do not remove humans from the story. They pressure humans into becoming something else inside it. In the old greener worlds, it is possible to live by following cycles that return with relative generosity. In a drying world, generosity becomes unreliable. Knowledge has to sharpen, cooperation has to deepen, or at least become more strategic. Risks have to be measured differently. A mistake made near plentiful water may be survivable. The same mistake made at the edge of advancing aridity can mean death for an individual, a family, or an entire band. What survives in the record suggests that this pressure does not simply reduce options. In some ways, it creates new ones, though at terrible cost. It opens migration corridors while closing familiar habitats. It drives experiments in adaptation that would not have emerged in the same form under easier conditions. And yet the desert never tells a simple story. Scholars still debate exactly how decisive these dry phases were in different regions, and no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of human transformation that follows them. Climate is powerful, but climate does not act alone. Geography matters. Species distribution matters, social ties matter. The evidence remains incomplete, and some of the most important moments are preserved only in fragments. A layer of pollen showing grasses gave way to scrub, a cluster of stone tools near an extinct lake, the chemistry of ancient sediments, the bones of fish where fish should no longer be possible, the changing teeth of animals adapting to harder vegetation, the position of camps shifting closer and closer to the last reliable water. Nothing about this story survives in full. It has to be assembled from clues scattered across enormous distances and immense spans of time. Still, the broad shape is clear enough to be haunting. There are places in North Africa, Arabia, Central Asia, and elsewhere where people once lived in landscapes far wetter than they are now. Some of these regions supported rivers, marshes, open grasslands, and chains of lakes. Human groups hunted there, gathered there, perhaps buried their dead there, raised children there, and built their seasonal routines around a world that could still feed movement without immediately punishing it. Then, gradually, the rhythm faltered, rain belts shifted, monsoons weakened or retreated, vegetation thinned, dust increased, lakes contracted, entire ecosystems fragmented into isolated refuges. Those who remained had to become experts not in abundance, but in dwindling abundance. They had to recognize the difference between a bad year and a permanent trend without the benefit of charts, models, or written memory. They had only the land itself, and the land was changing faster than the inherited wisdom could comfortably absorb. It is possible that some of the most important human abilities become more valuable under exactly these conditions. The capacity to remember distant water sources, the patience to move before a place becomes unlivable, the discipline to save rather than consume immediately, the social intelligence required to maintain bonds across groups, so information can travel even when resources do not, the ability to interpret faint signs, bird movement, the colour of vegetation on a distant rise, the texture of soil, the timing of animal migrations, the smell of moisture in wind. None of this is glamorous in the way later history likes to celebrate innovation. There are no monuments here, no named inventors, no royal inscriptions announcing success. But a great deal of human history depends on these quiet competencies, developed under pressure in environments that offer very little margin for error. There is another unsettling aspect to this story. The desert does not merely force people to leave. Sometimes it traps them first. As the good land shrinks, surviving populations can become concentrated around the last dependable rivers, springs, wetlands, or uplands. In those narrow zones, life may intensify even as the wider world empties. Competition becomes sharper. Knowledge of territory becomes more guarded. Cooperation may become indispensable, but so may exclusion. A landscape in decline can produce both solidarity and tension. It can make human groups more interdependent and more dangerous to one another at the same time. The image of ancient life in a drying world is not just one of lonely wandering. It is also one of crowded refuge, of repeated return to the same precious places, of negotiations carried out through kinship, custom, or force. From far above, with the false clarity of hindsight, the pattern can seem almost clean. A region dries, populations move, adaptations emerge, the story continues elsewhere. On the ground, it would have felt nothing like that. It would have felt local, immediate, confusing. One valley failing before another, one herd not arriving, one journey that used to be manageable becoming fatal, one elder insisting the rains will return because they always have, one younger hunter noticing that they do not return in the old way anymore, a child growing up in the same named place as a grandparent, yet inheriting a different world altogether. The transformation is not only environmental, it is psychological. It erodes trust in continuity. It teaches that landscapes themselves are mortal. This is the deeper reason the desert matters, not simply because it is harsh, but because it reveals how fragile a human world can be before humans have any means of stabilizing it. Later societies will build irrigation systems, reservoirs, granaries, roads, states, and written records. They will still struggle with drought, sometimes catastrophically, but they will at least possess institutions that can store surplus and memory. The people living through the earliest great desert expansions have almost none of that insulation. Their archive is oral, portable, embodied. Their planning horizon is tied to seasons, trails, kin, and experience. When the environment turns hard enough, that archive must either adapt or fail, and in adapting it changes the people who carry it. So the story begins not with a blank wasteland, but with a place in the middle of becoming one, a place that used to give more than it gives now, a place where human beings do not yet know how much they are about to be altered by scarcity. The dry wind crossing it today moves over old camps, dead shorelines, forgotten migration routes, and buried chapters of human resilience. It moves over the remains of a transformation so large that it helped decide who could move, who could endure, and what kinds of minds and societies could survive a harder earth. The desert looks empty only to those who do not know how much happened here. In truth, it is crowded with endings, and with the beginnings forced out of them. If the desert feels like an ending, it is only because it has forgotten how to show what came before. Beneath the dry crust, beneath the dust that lifts and settles without purpose, there are older layers that tell a different story entirely. a story in which this same landscape holds water in abundance, where the ground does not crack but yields, where the horizon is not a blur of heat but a shifting mosaic of grass, shrubs, and scattered trees. It is difficult to picture now, but what survives in the record suggests that many of the world's great deserts were once alive in ways that would seem almost impossible to anyone standing there today. There are places deep in what is now the Sahara, where the remains of ancient lakes stretch for kilometers, their former shorelines still visible as faint rings etched into the land. Some of these lakes were large enough to rival inland seas. Their waters supported fish, crocodiles, hippos, and dense populations of birds. Around them moved herds of grazing animals, antelope, wild cattle, and other species that depended on seasonal growth. And among these animals moved human groups, not as desperate survivors clinging to the edge of extinction, but as participants in a functioning ecosystem that provided options, variation, and relative stability. The desert, at that time, is not yet a boundary. It is a corridor. The same pattern appears in other regions, in parts of Arabia. Now defined by dunes and barren plateaus, there is evidence of ancient rivers cutting through valleys that today see almost no rainfall. In Central Asia, areas that are now dry basins once held networks of wetlands and shallow lakes. Even in places that are still semi-arid today, the balance used to lean more heavily toward life. Rainfall patterns were different, more reliable, more generous. Vegetation covered ground that now lies exposed. The atmosphere itself carried more moisture, and the cycles that sustained ecosystems operated with a rhythm that could be trusted within the span of a human lifetime. For the people living in these environments, movement is still essential, but it is not yet driven by scarcity alone. They follow animals, harvest seasonal plants, fish in lakes and rivers, and shift camps in patterns that respond to abundance rather than its absence. There is risk, as there always is, but it is a different kind of risk. A dry season may come, but it is expected to end. A water source may fluctuate, but others exist within reachable distance. The land is not uniform, but it is interconnected. A failed resource in one area can often be replaced by another nearby. This flexibility shapes behavior in ways that are subtle but important. It allows for experimentation without immediate catastrophe. It supports a kind of confidence in the continuity of the landscape. Archaeological evidence hints at this world in fragments that feel almost out of place. Stone tools scattered along what are now dry lake beds. Grinding stones indicating the processing of plant foods that require more stable vegetation. Remains of fish species in locations far removed from any present-day water. In some areas, there are even traces of what appear to be early forms of settlement seasonal camps that were returned to repeatedly, suggesting that certain places held consistent value over time. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how dense or permanent these populations were. But there is little doubt that these were not marginal lands in the way they are often perceived today. It is important not to romanticize this greener past. It is not a paradise. It is still a landscape that demands skill, awareness, and adaptation. Predators exist. Weather varies. Resources fluctuate. But compared to what follows, it offers a wider margin for error. It allows human groups to build routines that can persist across generations with relatively minor adjustments. Knowledge accumulates in a way that reinforces stability. Paths become familiar. Seasonal cycles become part of identity. The land, in a sense, teaches consistency. And that consistency shapes not only behavior, but expectations. People come to understand their world as something that returns. Rain returns, grass returns, Animals return, waterholes shrink and expand, but they do not vanish entirely. The memory of the land is aligned with the land itself. What one generation learns is largely applicable to the next. This is not certainty, but it is continuity, and continuity is a powerful foundation for how humans organize their lives. There are also signs that these environments may have supported cultural developments that depend on relative stability. The repetition of campsites suggests patterns of return. The presence of certain tool types in consistent locations suggests that knowledge is being passed on in a structured way. In some regions, rock art begins to appear, depicting animals and scenes that reflect a world richer in life than the one that exists there now. These images are not just decoration. They're evidence of a relationship between people and place that includes memory, meaning, and perhaps early forms of symbolic thinking tied directly to the environment. But even in this more forgiving world, there are hints of fragility. The systems that support life here depend on larger forces that operate beyond human control. Shifts in Earth's orbit, subtle changes in solar radiation, alterations in atmospheric circulation, all of these can influence where and when rain falls. At the time, no one living in these landscapes could have understood those mechanisms. They could only respond to their effects, and at first, those effects would have been small. A slightly shorter wet season, a delay in the arrival of rains, a lake that does not fill quite as fully as it did before. It is in these small changes that the future desert begins to take shape, not as a sudden event, but as a deviation from expectation, a pattern that no longer holds perfectly. At first, it may be easy to dismiss. Weather has always varied. A bad year can be followed by a good one. But what survives in the record suggests that over time, these deviations accumulate. They begin to align in one direction. Wet phases become less frequent. Dry phases last longer. Vegetation begins to thin in certain areas, especially those that are already on the edge of viability. For the people living there, this shift would not have been experienced as a clear turning point. There is no single moment when the land announces that it is changing permanently. Instead, there is a gradual erosion of reliability, a sense that something is different, even if it cannot yet be fully explained. Older knowledge still works, but not as consistently. Paths that once led to water now lead to uncertainty. Animals alter their behavior. The landscape becomes less predictable. And with that loss of predictability comes a new kind of pressure. One of the most important aspects of this transition is that it unfolds across generations. A person born into the early stages of drying may still experience enough good years to believe that the system is fundamentally intact. Their children may begin to notice more frequent disruptions. Their grandchildren may grow up in a world where the old patterns no longer apply at all. This generational layering creates a complex response. Some groups may hold on to older strategies longer than is sustainable. Others may adapt more quickly, abandoning familiar routines in favor of new ones. The evidence suggests that there is no single, uniform reaction. Human responses vary, just as the environment does. There is also the question of how far these greener conditions extended and how interconnected different regions were. Some scholars argue that during wetter periods, corridors of habitable land may have linked areas that are now separated by vast deserts. These corridors could have allowed for movement of both animals and humans across distances that later became barriers. If this is the case, then the drying of these regions does not just reduce local resources, it breaks connections. It isolates populations. It transforms what was once a network into a series of fragments. This fragmentation has profound implications. It changes the scale at which people can move. It alters the flow of information. It limits the ability to recover from local shortages by accessing distant resources. It creates pockets of survival rather than continuous landscapes of opportunity. And in doing so, it begins to set the stage for the kind of intense pressure that will define the desert as it fully emerges. What makes this phase so important is that it represents a world on the edge of transformation without yet fully committing to it. The land is still alive, still capable of supporting life in a way that feels sustainable. But the underlying conditions are shifting. The balance is tilting. And the people who live there are beginning to feel the first signs of a change that will eventually force them to rethink nearly everything about how they survive. In hindsight, it is clear that this greener world is temporary. But for those living within it, it is simply the world as it is known. That is what makes the coming transformation so powerful. It does not just introduce hardship, it removes the foundation on which entire ways of life are built. It turns familiarity into uncertainty. It replaces expectation with doubt. And it does so slowly enough that adaptation is possible, but relentlessly enough that adaptation becomes unavoidable. The desert, in this sense, is not just a place, it is a process, and that process begins not with sand, but with grass. The change begins so quietly that it could be mistaken for ordinary variation. Each season arrives thin, but not unprecedented. Rains come late. A familiar marsh withdraws a little farther from its old edge. Grass returns, though not with the same confidence. Herds still appear, but in smaller numbers or on a slightly altered route, as if the animals themselves are testing a world that has become subtly less dependable. Nothing in these first stages looks dramatic enough to deserve the word collapse. The land still works. It simply works less well than before. For people who live by reading landscapes, this kind of change is both easier to notice and harder to interpret than a sudden disaster. They would have felt it in small disruptions, journeys taking longer because expected water is lower, hunting becoming more uncertain because animal timing has shifted, plant foods ripening differently, or failing in places that once produced them without much trouble. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in environmental records across several now arid regions suggests a drawn-out pattern of weakening rainfall and unstable recovery. The green world does not vanish all at once. It flickers. Behind this flickering lie forces that no human group could have seen directly. Over long spans of time, subtle changes in Earth's orbit alter how solar energy is distributed across the planet. These shifts can strengthen or weaken monsoon systems, move rain belts north or south, and reshape the atmospheric engines that determine whether a region receives dependable seasonal moisture or long, punishing dryness. In the Sahara, for example, wetter phases are closely tied to times when orbital conditions strengthen the African monsoon, pushing rain farther into the interior than it reaches today. When those conditions fade, the monsoon retreats, grasslands shrink, lakes begin to contract, dust rises from newly exposed ground and enters the atmosphere, which can then reinforce aridity by affecting cloud formation and heat balance. No single explanation fully accounts for every local change, but the larger pattern is clear. The climate system tilts, and the land responds. Yet climate alone is never the whole story. A slight reduction in rainfall does not produce the same result everywhere. In one valley, deep soils and sheltered topography may preserve vegetation longer than expected. In another, water drains too quickly, and decline begins early. One lake may survive as a refuge for generations while nearby wetlands disappear. This regional unevenness matters because humans do not experience climate as a graph. They experience it as a patchwork. One place fails before another. One route stays open while the next becomes lethal. A landscape can be turning against its inhabitants in the aggregate, while still offering temporary reassurance in scattered pockets. This is one reason the shift can be so deceptive. When enough good ground remains, people can treat the change as manageable. They can move a little farther, stay a little less long, widen their seasonal circuits, adjust their camps, and continue. In that stage, adaptation still feels like variation, not surrender. What once was a broad, forgiving world starts to require sharper judgment, but it has not yet turned openly hostile. The danger lies in how long that ambiguity can last. A human group may adapt successfully for generations without realizing that the overall direction is still downward. The lakes tell this story in the clearest way. Their shorelines do not simply disappear, they retreat. Sediments show cycles of expansion and contraction. In wetter years, water returns and restores a sense of continuity. In drier stretches, shorelines pull back, leaving rings of mud and mineral deposits where open water used to lie. Fish populations shrink or become trapped in isolated basins. Birds alter their nesting grounds. Grazers cluster more heavily around the remaining green margins, stripping vegetation faster than it can recover. Around these lakes, the old abundance narrows into a thinner and more contested ribbon of life. Human groups would have been drawn to these shrinking edges again and again, because the alternatives beyond them were becoming increasingly unreliable. At first, this concentration may even create the illusion of richness. Animals are easier to find when they gather near the last water. People see more tracks, more dung, more movement in fewer places. Resources, compressed into smaller zones, can seem plentiful for a time, but this kind of abundance is unstable. It is the abundance of retreat, not growth. It means that the wider landscape is no longer supporting the old dispersal of life. The same narrowing that makes a waterhole look busy also means that every species depending on it is under more pressure than before. Humans, in these circumstances, are not simply observing environmental decline. They are caught inside its bottlenecks. There is a human tendency, ancient as any other, to trust what has worked before. Paths that led to water in childhood are followed again in adulthood. Elders remember recoveries from earlier bad years and pass down confidence along with caution. This can be useful, but it can also become dangerous when a temporary fluctuation becomes a structural shift. Scholars still debate how clearly such long transitions would have been recognized by the people experiencing them, but it is difficult to imagine that no one noticed. A world of hunters, foragers, fishers, and herders in formation depends on noticing. The question is not whether they sensed change, but when they concluded that old expectations could no longer be trusted. That moment, if it ever came as a distinct realization, would not have been the same everywhere. In some places, the change may have felt abrupt because local thresholds were crossed quickly. A spring fails. A shallow lake becomes too saline. A route between two dependable refuges becomes too exposed to cross safely. In other places, the old world lingers longer, and this delay may draw people into dangerous confidence. A region that remains livable after surrounding areas have deteriorated can become both refuge and trap. It attracts movement in from outside while quietly exhausting its own resilience. The plants record the turning of the world with a kind of impersonal honesty. Pollen preserved in ancient sediments shows grasslands giving way in some areas to sparser vegetation, more suited to dryness. Trees retreat from exposed ground and persist mainly in better watered pockets. Wetland plants disappear from basins that once held standing water. Species adapted to harsher conditions expand. To a human observer, this shift would not have been described in botanical terms, but its meaning would have been obvious enough. Shade becomes rarer, forage weakens, seeds and tubers are no longer available in the old quantities, fuel for fire changes, building materials change, animals change with them. The animals may, in some ways, serve as the earliest warning system. Herds do not obey memory, they obey opportunity. When water and grazing decline, they move accordingly. Their routes become longer, less predictable, or more dangerous to follow. Some species disappear from areas where they were once dependable. Others arrive only briefly. Predators follow these shifts, which means humans must navigate not only hunger, but changing patterns of risk. A landscape that was once legible through long familiarity begins to feel unstable in all directions. The known animals are elsewhere. The known plants are failing. The known places are becoming intermittent. This is where climate change stops being an abstract background and becomes an intimate daily pressure. Longer walks for water mean less time for other tasks. Failed hunts mean weaker bodies for travel. More energy spent moving between scattered resources means less room for injury, illness, or error. Children and elders become more vulnerable. The burden of carrying knowledge where to go, when to leave, which paths still work, which signs matter now becomes heavier. A changing climate does not simply reduce comfort. It makes information more precious and mistakes more final. Even so, the process is not linear in any simple sense. There are reversals, pauses, and regional recoveries. Wet years return, sometimes enough to encourage people back into places that had begun to fail. This matters because it complicates human decisions. If decline were perfectly steady, adaptation might be straightforward. But a world that worsens with occasional relief is much harder to read. Hope remains rational longer than it should. Old routes remain just viable enough to tempt reuse. No single explanation fully accounts for the timing of movement, because movement depends not only on worsening conditions, but on how people interpret brief improvements inside a longer collapse. This uncertainty may be one of the most formative pressures of all. In a stable environment, skill means knowing the pattern. In an unstable one, skill increasingly means recognizing when the pattern itself has changed. That requires more than memory. It requires judgment, comparison, and perhaps a willingness to defy inherited confidence. The people who do best in such a world may not be the strongest in any simple physical sense. They may be the ones most capable of reading weak signals, revising plans, and acting before the evidence feels emotionally complete. A drying landscape begins to reward not just endurance, but anticipation. And anticipation changes culture. The old seasonal confidence starts to fray. Decisions that were once routine become weightier. When to leave matters more. How long to stay matters more. Who to trust for information matters more. The horizon itself begins to carry new meaning. Not just distance, but possibility. Not just the edge of familiar territory, but the location of whatever still works beyond it. The desert has not fully arrived yet, but its logic is already taking hold. It enters human life first as uncertainty, then as discipline, and only later as a visible sea of dryness. By the time sand is dominant, the deeper transformation is already well underway. The real turning point comes earlier, during these years and generations when the world is still partly green but no longer reliably so. That is when inherited knowledge begins to strain. That is when movement starts to change from habit into strategy. That is when abundance stops being assumed and starts being hunted across widening distances. The climate begins to turn, and with it turns the human relationship to land, to time, and to survival itself. The struggle over water does not begin with open violence. It begins with convergence. Paths that once spread outward across a broad and forgiving landscape start bending toward the same few dependable places. A spring that used to serve one small group now draws several. A shrinking lake edge becomes lined with tracks layered over tracks, human and animal pressed into the same damp margin. The wide spacing that once allowed distance, flexibility, and quiet avoidance starts to disappear. As the land dries, movement compresses, and wherever movement compresses, tension follows. In the older, wetter world, people and animals can distribute themselves across many zones. Herds graze over large areas. Human groups circulate with enough room to avoid direct competition most of the time. Encounters still happen, and not always peacefully. But the environment offers alternatives. If one water source is crowded, another may be reachable. If a hunting ground is overused, movement elsewhere remains possible. The drying world strips away these alternatives one by one. It narrows the field of survival until the same places matter to everyone at once. For animals, this narrowing is immediate and unsentimental. Grazers cluster near the last green growth. Predators shadow them. Birds change routes. Species that once ranged widely become tied to thin corridors of water and shade. This concentration creates moments of apparent richness, but it is a nervous richness, temporary and unstable. A waterhole packed with life is also a place under strain. Vegetation is trampled faster. Mud becomes fouled. Disease may spread more easily. Every visit drains the site further, and yet no one can afford not to come. The landscape is beginning to organize itself around necessity. Humans entering such a landscape face a new calculation. A water source is no longer simply useful, it is strategic. To know where dependable water lies becomes a form of power. To reach it first matters. To hold access to it, defend it, share it, or trade it matters even more. Scholars still debate how often conflict in these prehistoric settings took direct violent form, because the evidence is fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Skeletal trauma exists in some ancient populations, but it is not always possible to tie injuries clearly to organized competition over resources. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for crowding around scarce water without allowing for some rise in tension. A landscape that forces repeated convergence does not encourage indifference. That tension would not always express itself as fighting. Just as often, it may have taken the form of rules, habits, and silent negotiations. Who arrives first? Who camps upstream? Who waits? Who leaves before the resource is exhausted? Which kin ties allow temporary sharing? Which remembered alliances matter when strangers appear at the same spring in a bad season? In harsh environments, cooperation can be just as essential as aggression, and often more efficient. A group that defends water too rigidly may provoke retaliation, or cut itself off from information it later needs. A group that shares too freely may endanger its own children. Survival in such places is not moral in any simple sense. It is relational, strategic, and often painfully local. This is where the desert begins to reshape social behavior as much as physical movement. A waterhole is not only a resource, it is a meeting point, a testing ground, and sometimes a memory bank. People learn who can be trusted under stress. They learn which groups pass through seasonally, which arrive desperate, which bring knowledge of conditions elsewhere. News travels with bodies. A drying world makes information and water almost inseparable. To know that another spring has failed, that a herd has changed its route, that vegetation still survives in an upland pocket days away, can be as valuable as food itself. Around shrinking refuges, the exchange of knowledge becomes more urgent because conditions change too fast for isolation to remain safe. But urgency does not create harmony. The same concentration that encourages contact also sharpens suspicion. When resources are abundant, hospitality is easier. When scarcity tightens, every stranger represents both possibility and threat. They may bring news. They may also bring hunger. They may become allies. They may also remain. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the archaeological record suggests that repeated use of certain sites intensifies during stressful environmental phases. This does not prove conflict on its own, yet it does point to a world in which critical places are revisited again and again by people with increasingly limited options. The animals intensify this drama in their own way. As waterholes shrink, hunting can become briefly more efficient because prey must gather in predictable locations. But this too is a dangerous gift. Overhunting near constrained water sources can break a fragile system faster. Herds already pressured by poor grazing and long travel may become more vulnerable, and their decline feeds directly back into human insecurity. People in a drying landscape are not simply competing with one another. They are competing within a larger bottleneck that includes every species depending on the same vanishing ground. The battle around water is not human against human alone. It is all life compressed into the same narrowing margin. This changes the rhythm of daily existence. The approach to water can no longer be casual. It requires timing. Arrive too late, and the mud is churned. The water fouled. The game already driven off. Stay too long, and the site is exhausted or dangerous. Move too early, and the next source may not hold. The logic of the landscape becomes harsher and more exacting. Children must be watched more closely. Camps must be placed more carefully. Fires may need to be smaller. Waste matters. Noise matters. The difference between a usable refuge and a ruined one can be surprisingly thin. And then there is the strain of repetition. Scarcity is one thing during a single hard season. It is another when it becomes the pattern by which life is organized. Repeated returns to shrinking resources produce not only physical pressure, but emotional wear. There would have been memory in these places, not as written record, but as embodied caution. The last time this spring failed, the year a child died on the route between two pools, the valley where strangers arrived before dawn, the waterhole where game once came in numbers so large it seemed impossible they would ever thin. Such memories become part of the map. In a desert in the making, geography and experience bind together more tightly than ever. Some groups likely respond by becoming more mobile, reducing the time they spend in crowded refuges and relying on broader circuits of movement. Others may do the opposite, anchoring themselves around the most dependable remaining water and defending access through familiarity, numbers, or social ties. Neither strategy is guaranteed. Greater mobility increases options but raises exposure and energy cost. Greater attachment to a water source offers stability but risks entrapment when conditions worsen further. Scholars still debate how these different responses varied across regions and over time, because there is no single model that fits every drying landscape. But what seems increasingly likely is that the pressure of water scarcity forces societies, however small and fluid, to become more deliberate about territory and access. That deliberation may leave traces in behavior long before it leaves clear traces in material remains. people begin to remember not just resources, but rights, obligations, and precedents. Who used this place before? Who has kin nearby? Who owes a favour after shelter in the last bad season? It would be too simple to call this ownership in any modern sense, but it may represent an important step toward more formalised ideas of belonging and exclusion, when the earth offers less room. Boundaries, whether spoken, implied, or enforced, gain weight. And still, for all this tension, waterholes and shrinking green margins are also places where culture can deepen. Knowledge is exchanged there. Children learn by watching adults manage risk. Techniques for tracking, storage, tool repair, and seasonal timing are refined under pressure. Songs, warnings, and remembered routes may be repeated more carefully because forgetting has become more costly. The desert does not produce only conflict, it produces concentration, and concentration can harden knowledge as effectively as it hardens suspicion. From a distance, it may be tempting to imagine these battlegrounds as dramatic scenes of direct struggle. Sometimes they may have been, but more often the battle is quieter and more relentless. It is fought in choices about when to leave, how much to take, whom to trust, and what to do when a once reliable refuge becomes crowded beyond safety. It is fought in the exhaustion of walking farther for water and returning with less. It is fought in the discipline required not to consume everything at once. It is fought in the recognition that every good place now has too many eyes fixed on it. By the time a landscape reaches this stage, the change is no longer theoretical. Drying is no longer a pattern observed in plants, sediments, or distant roots. It is a daily contest over the last remaining anchors of life. Waterholes become centres of gravity around which entire worlds tighten and fray. And as they do, they force humans into a new kind of existence, one defined not by the freedom of a living landscape, but by the pressure of sharing its final generous places with everything else that still hopes to survive. By now, the change is no longer something noticed only in the distance. It has entered the body. It is there in the dryness of the mouth at the wrong hour of morning, in the longer pause before setting out, in the altered weight of what must be carried because what used to be found along the way can no longer be trusted. A drying world does not simply reduce resources, it multiplies decisions. Every ordinary act begins to divide into risk, to stay or move, to follow an old route or test a new one, to eat now or hold back, to push children harder on a journey or stop sooner and lose ground. The landscape, once difficult but legible, becomes a place where small judgments begin to matter with new severity. In a richer environment, survival still requires skill, but there is more forgiveness built into the land. A failed hunt can be balanced by gathered plants. A missed opportunity at one water source can be repaired by reaching another. Time itself feels different when alternatives exist. In a drying landscape, alternatives begin to thin. This does not mean that people instantly become desperate wanderers. What survives in the record suggests something far more disciplined. Human groups respond with adjustment, then adjustment again, refining movement, diet, timing, and social behaviour in ways that may seem minor from the outside, but together mark a major transformation. Daily life becomes an exercise in calculating uncertainty. Food is one of the first things to change in texture, rhythm, and meaning. In greener times, diets can be broad and seasonally varied in ways that support a certain confidence. Fish from lakes and rivers, game from open grasslands, gathered seeds, fruits, roots, tubers, small animals, birds, eggs. These different strands of subsistence do not eliminate hardship, but they create redundancy. As aridity spreads, redundancy begins to collapse. Wetland foods decline with the wetlands. Large game may still exist, but their movements become less reliable and their condition weaker. Plant foods become patchier, harder to predict, more closely tied to microenvironments that may fail unexpectedly. Hunger is not always starvation. More often, at first, it is narrowing, fewer options, less margin, more dependence on timing. That narrowing forces a different kind of attention. A patch of edible plants that was once a useful addition may become essential. A species once ignored in better years may now be worth the labour of processing. Bitter seeds, tough tubers, dryland grasses, small game that offers little return in ordinary conditions all may become more important as broad abundance withdraws. This is not simply a decline in comfort, it is a change in knowledge. People must know more about marginal foods, about detoxifying, grinding, soaking, roasting, preserving. They must become students of what a poorer landscape still yields. Some of these skills may have existed already, used occasionally or in bad seasons. Under pressure, they move closer to the centre of life. Water transforms daily planning even more completely. In a wetter world, thirst is urgent but often local. In a drying one, thirst becomes architectural. It determines route, pace, camp placement, and the order of tasks. The day may need to be organised around a spring that lies farther away than it once did, or around a pool that can no longer support lingering. Carrying capacity matters differently. Containers, skins, plant vessels, ostrich eggshells in some regions, and other portable storage methods where available take on greater significance, because a person who can move water can move opportunity. Scholars still debate how extensively early populations in different arid regions developed portable water technologies, because the organic evidence is often poorly preserved. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for repeated survival in drying landscapes without assuming practical innovations in carrying, caching, or rationing water. Shelter changes too, though not always in obvious ways. In a stable landscape, camps can be chosen with relative freedom shade, visibility, proximity to resources, protection from wind, access to fuel. In a harsher environment, some of those preferences become luxuries. A campsite may be chosen because it lies within reach of water, even if it is otherwise exposed or poor. Temporary shelters may need to become quicker to build and easier to abandon. People may use caves, rock overhangs, or upland ridges differently depending on seasonal pressure. Fuel becomes a more serious concern as wood and brush thin out. Fire, once central to cooking, warmth, protection, and social life, may now require greater effort to maintain. Even the simple act of cooking a meal can become more expensive in time and labour when dry fuel is scarce or dispersed. Mobility, meanwhile, stops being a pattern and becomes a strategy. There is a difference between moving because that is how one lives in a seasonal world, and moving because staying has become dangerous. The first kind of mobility can be confident and rhythmic. The second is cautious, corrective, sometimes forced. Distances between reliable points grow. Journeys that used to be routine become logistical events. Groups may split temporarily so that some scout while others conserve strength. People may leave weaker individuals in sheltered places while stronger members search ahead. The evidence remains incomplete, but ethnographic parallels and archaeological inference suggest that mobility under increasing aridity is rarely random. It becomes planned with greater care, because movement itself is exhausting, and a failed journey can destroy a group faster than a poor camp can. This is where memory begins to harden into survival infrastructure. In a landscape shedding reliability, The mind becomes a kind of map storage system more valuable than any single tool. Not merely memory of where water once was, but memory of when it lasts longest. Which approach is safest? Where shade falls in late season, where game crosses after a failed rain, where edible plants survive in low depressions, where stone of usable quality can still be found. Where another group might grant passage or warn of danger, a person who carries such memory carries more than information. They carry continuity in a world that has stopped providing it freely. That burden is not equally distributed. Elders may hold root knowledge and long memory of past recoveries. Skilled hunters read animal behavior. Gatherers know hidden plant rhythms. Toolmakers understand the stone sources worth detouring toward. Parents calculate the tolerances of children. The social body of a group becomes more specialized in subtle ways, not necessarily through formal roles, but through increasing dependence on different forms of expertise. A drying world sharpens the value of competence. It also sharpens the consequences of losing it. Injury, illness, or the death of a knowledgeable individual can now matter far beyond personal grief. It can erase a route, a seasonal timing, a tested response to danger. This may be one reason teaching becomes more deliberate under pressure. In forgiving environments, knowledge can be absorbed through repeated exposure with some room for mistakes. In harsher conditions, mistakes become expensive faster. Children must learn sooner what signs matter. They must recognize the look of bad water, the feel of unstable ground, the warning in animal silence, the usefulness of apparently insignificant plants, the discipline of leaving while resources still remain rather than waiting until they fail completely. What survives in the archaeological record cannot directly reveal these lessons, but the logic of life in such environments strongly suggests that transmission of practical knowledge becomes even more central. Survival depends not just on having skill, but on reproducing it reliably. There is also the emotional weather of such a life, though it leaves few direct traces. Constant decision-making is its own form of strain. To live where every route carries doubt and every resource may disappoint is to inhabit a world of quiet vigilance. Rest is thinner. Confidence is provisional. Even success does not remove pressure. It merely postpones the next test. And yet human beings are adaptable in ways that can make even severe hardship feel normal once it is repeated enough. A child raised in a drying world may not experience it as loss, only as reality. The grief belongs more fully to those who remember the older abundance, who can compare the present against what the land once offered. That generational divide matters. Elders may preserve stories of fuller lakes, thicker reeds, easier hunts, routes that no longer work. Younger adults, shaped by scarcity, may trust caution over memory, mobility over attachment, innovation over custom. Neither perspective is wholly right or wrong. The old knowledge contains the map of a vanished world, but not all of it has become useless. The new judgment is fitted to harder conditions, but it may surrender places too soon if wetter years briefly return. Scholars still debate how communities balanced inherited patterns with flexible adaptation during long environmental stress, because such negotiations rarely fossilize. But it is difficult to imagine that the friction did not exist. A drying world changes not only what decisions must be made, but whose judgment carries authority when old expectations fail. The body itself begins to tell the story in harsher detail. Nutritional stress may become more common in some populations. Teeth record dietary change. Bones may reflect heavier movement or repeated strain. Settlement patterns shift toward defensible or water-linked locations. Toolkits may become more portable, more repairable, more specialized for extraction and processing rather than easy harvest. None of these changes alone explains the whole transformation, but together they suggest a life no longer arranged around opportunity, but around disciplined response to diminishing returns. This is the point at which the desert stops being merely a changing backdrop and becomes an organizer of human behavior. It enters meals, routes, sleeping places, teaching, pacing, hierarchy, and habit. It teaches frugality without ceremony. It teaches suspicion of comfort. It teaches that a good day is not proof of safety, only a temporary reprieve inside a world still tightening. Every decision grows heavier because the cost of being wrong is rising. And still, people continue. They do not simply collapse into the sand. They adapt with patience, ingenuity, and often exhausting restraint. But the form of life they are preserving is no longer the same one they inherited. Daily choices, repeated under pressure, are quietly remaking human existence. The desert is not only taking things away, it is forcing people to become more intentional than before, to live by judgment more than abundance, and to discover that survival in a harder world depends less on strength alone than on choosing well when almost every choice has begun to hurt. The first footprints do not announce themselves as history. They are simply departures, a camp used less often, a lakeshore abandoned earlier in the season, a hunting route extended beyond its old limit, one family leaving ahead of the others because the water has dropped too far to wait, another returning to a place remembered from childhood and finding that memory no longer matches the ground. Human migration rarely begins with a grand decision. More often it begins with a sequence of smaller recognitions, each one practical, each one local, until movement stops being temporary adjustment and becomes the central fact of survival. In the greener world, movement had rhythm. People travelled because the land offered alternating opportunities. They followed game, ripening plants, fish runs, better shelter, cooler high ground, safer seasonal camps. But these movements still took place inside a landscape that felt broadly habitable. One moved through it, not away from it. As the desert advances, that relationship changes. Travel becomes less cyclical and more directional. Some routes remain useful for a time, but others close. Corridors of grass and water narrow into strings of refuge. Open crossings become longer and riskier. The map of life does not simply shrink, it reconfigures. This reconfiguration is one of the deepest ways the desert forces humans to change. It does not merely push populations outward in a neat expanding ring. It creates a far more uneven pattern of attraction, repulsion, and entrapment. Some people are driven toward river valleys that still carry dependable water. Others move along the edges of uplands, following pockets of rainfall that linger longer than the lowlands below. Some cross regions that later become nearly impassable, taking advantage of brief climatic windows before those paths close again. Others remain where they are, clustering around the last viable refuges until those too begin to fail. Migration in such a world is not one road. It is a shifting network of choices made under pressure. What survives in the archaeological and paleo-environmental records suggests that these networks matter enormously. During wetter phases, now arid regions may have served as corridors linking populations across great distances. Lakes, rivers, and savanna belts created chains of habitability through places that later became barriers of heat and dryness. When these corridors weaken, populations that once could move, meet, and exchange knowledge across broad zones become fragmented. At the same time, the remaining routes become more important than ever. A river valley, a line of springs, a semi-arid highland, a coastal margin. These are no longer just landscapes, they are arteries. In Africa, Arabia, and beyond. Scholars still debate the exact timing and significance of these shifting corridors, especially in relation to major human dispersals. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every movement. Climate opens doors, but people do not always walk through them immediately. Geography matters. Existing population pressures matter. Predators, disease, local competition, and simple chance matter. Yet the broader pattern is difficult to ignore. When formerly green regions begin to dry, humans do not vanish from the story. They are redistributed by it. Their movements, repeated over generations, begin to redraw the human presence on the map. Some of these migrations are short, hardly visible except in hindsight. A group shifts its circuit by a few valleys. A seasonal camp is replaced by another closer to reliable water. A familiar zone is no longer crossed in late dry months. These seem minor at first, but over time such adjustments accumulate. A route used for generations falls out of memory because it no longer works. A new track becomes standard because children grow up walking it. The difference between migration and adaptation is not always clear in the moment. Sometimes migration is simply adaptation stretched across enough years that the old home becomes unreachable except as a story. Other movements are larger and more decisive. A population that can no longer survive within a drying basin may follow animals or watercourses outward into unfamiliar territory. A group trapped between worsening aridity and crowded refuges may gamble on a crossing that previous generations avoided. Such journeys would have been perilous. A route that looks possible on a wet year may fail in a dry one. A spring remembered by distant kin may have already vanished. People moving into inhabited land do not enter emptiness. They enter someone else's map, someone else's routes, someone else's claims and warnings. Migration is not only an environmental response, it is a social encounter. This encounter can take many forms. There may be exchange, intermarriage, imitation, avoidance, or conflict. Newcomers may bring tools, techniques, stories of harsher lands behind them, or knowledge of resources the residents have not used in the same way. They may also bring hunger and desperation. The record rarely preserves these first meetings clearly, but what survives in genetics, material culture, and settlement shifts suggests that ancient populations are repeatedly mixed, separated, and remixed by such movements. The desert does not just send people away, it helps create new human combinations. There is a tendency to imagine migration as a sign of failure, as the final act after a homeland has been lost. But in many cases, migration is not collapse, it is foresight, it is the refusal to wait too long. In a drying world, those who leave early may do better than those who cling to familiar ground until escape becomes harder. To move before crisis feels complete requires a different kind of courage than simply enduring. It means trusting weak signals. It means accepting that the remembered world is not coming back soon enough. It means choosing uncertainty elsewhere over diminishing certainty at home. The people who make such choices may help shape the future more than those who stay. Yet leaving has costs that are not only material. To move away from a known landscape is to lose an archive. The paths, landmarks, seasonal timings, and local signs that once organized life do not transfer easily. Even if a new place offers water and food, it initially lacks the density of meaning built by generations of use. The old home may have held burial sites, repeated camps, familiar stone sources, remembered dangers, and stories tied to hills, trees, and shorelines. A migration is therefore not just a change in location, It is a fracture in memory. New maps must be learned. New meanings must be attached to ground that at first is only functional. This is one reason why some groups likely resist movement for as long as possible. Attachment is rational, especially where occasional wet years make recovery seem plausible. Scholars still debate how often populations return to previously abandoned zones during brief climatic improvements, but there is little reason to think movement was always permanent at first. A drying world may produce cycles of leaving and return, hope and disappointment, reoccupation, and final abandonment. Such oscillation would make the decision to move even more difficult. To depart too early might mean surrendering a homeland that could still sustain life intermittently. To depart too late might mean dying on the route out. The children of migrants grow up inside a different relationship to landscape than their elders did. For them, the world is made of paths, thresholds, and transitions. Home may become less a fixed place than a network of remembered waypoints: a spring, a ridge, a cave, a dry river crossing, a patch of shade near stone suitable for tools. This does not mean attachment disappears. It means attachment becomes more portable. Identity begins to travel with people more fully because the land beneath them can no longer be trusted to remain itself. In this way, migration may change not only where humans live, but how they imagine belonging. The desert also creates dead ends. Not every route opens. Some basins dry faster than expected and trap the people who depend on them. Some corridors that once linked wider worlds become isolated pockets where populations are forced into prolonged refuge. These refugees may preserve life for centuries, even millennia, but at a cost. Isolation can reduce exchange, limit marriage networks, and bind communities tightly to fragile local conditions. A refuge is safety only until it is not. When it finally fails, those within it may be too weakened, too numerous, or too cut off to move easily. Migration pathways are therefore shaped not just by opportunity, but by timing. The same landscape can be a corridor in one age and a cage in another. Footsteps, of course, rarely survive. Wind erases them. Floods bury them. Later travellers cross over them. What endures instead are their consequences. Genetic signals appearing far from their likely origins. Tool traditions emerging in new places. Occupation patterns shifting toward coasts, river valleys, uplands, or ecological margins that can still support movement. Fossils and artifacts turning up along routes that later generations would never suspect had once been habitable. The desert keeps few direct records of departure, but it preserves the emptied spaces left behind. There is something profoundly human in this kind of migration. It is neither heroic in the later epic sense nor passive in the face of nature. It is practical, repetitive, often sorrowful, and deeply intelligent. It depends on reading a world that is withdrawing and finding. Within that withdrawal, the narrow lines along which life can still continue. It demands memory, courage, adaptability, and a willingness to loosen the bond between identity and place when place itself has become unstable. By now, the desert is not merely changing behavior within a homeland. It is helping decide which homelands remain possible at all. It forces people onto roads that are not roads yet, only sequences of viable ground. It closes old circuits and opens new horizons. It scatters some populations and compresses others. It turns geography into destiny, but not in a simple way. The fate of human groups begins to depend on whether they can find the right corridor at the right moment, leave before a refuge becomes a trap, and carry enough knowledge through the crossing to make another world legible on arrival. The footprints themselves are gone, but the map they made is still with us. It survives in where people later appear, in where they do not, in the roots etched into ancient sediments and abandoned shorelines, and in the quiet fact that some of the most important turns in human history begin not with conquest or invention, but with the decision to keep walking when the old land stops providing any reason to stay. At some point, endurance alone stops being enough, moving farther, choosing more carefully, remembering more precisely these strategies can extend survival, but they cannot fully replace what the land has withdrawn. A harder world begins to demand not just better decisions, but different tools. Not necessarily tools in the dramatic sense of invention appearing suddenly, but in the quieter accumulation of refinements, small changes that, taken together, allow people to extract more from less, to stretch resources further, and to operate within margins that would have been unthinkable in a more generous environment. The record of these changes is subtle. Stone tools do not announce the desperation or ingenuity behind them. They simply appear, scattered across sites, shaped by hands that understood what was required. Yet when examined over long spans, patterns begin to emerge. Tools become more specialized in some regions, more standardized in others. Edges are sharpened for particular tasks. Implements for processing plant foods, grinding stones. Pounding tools become more significant in areas where gathering tougher, drier resources becomes essential. The shift is not universal or uniform, and scholars still debate how directly environmental stress drives these changes. But what survives suggests a growing emphasis on efficiency. Efficiency, in a drying landscape, is not about speed, it is about return. How much energy must be spent to gain enough food, water, or material to justify the effort? In a world where abundance has narrowed, wasted effort becomes dangerous. A hunt that fails is not just a disappointment. It is lost energy that may not be easily replaced. A journey to a known water source that turns out to be dry is not simply an inconvenience. It is a threat that can cascade into further loss. Tools, therefore, begin to serve a more exacting purpose. They are not only extensions of the body, they are extensions of judgment. One of the most important shifts may lie in how people process what they gather. In a richer environment, some foods can be consumed with minimal preparation. In a harsher one, many of the available resources require transformation before they become edible or useful. Seeds may need to be ground into flour. Tubers may need to be detoxified. Tough plant fibers may need to be softened or broken down. This kind of processing takes time, skill, and equipment. It also requires planning. A group that invests effort in collecting and preparing marginal foods must coordinate its labor differently. Some members gather while others process. Time must be set aside not just for finding resources, but for making them usable. Storage becomes more valuable under these conditions, though its archaeological footprint is often faint. Organic containers decay. Temporary caches leave little trace. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for repeated survival in environments with fluctuating availability, without assuming some capacity to store or at least delay consumption. Whether through drying, burying, or simple rationing, the idea that food and water should be managed over time becomes more important. This represents a shift not only in behavior, but in thinking. It requires resisting immediate consumption in favor of future security, even when the present feels uncertain. Hunting, too, begins to reflect the pressures of a changing world. In open, well-watered landscapes, large game can sometimes be pursued with a degree of predictability. In a drying environment, animals become more cautious, more dispersed at times and more tightly clustered at others. They may be weaker, but they're also under stress, and stressed animals can be unpredictable. Hunters must adjust. Tracking becomes more refined. Ambush strategies may change as water sources become focal points. Smaller animals, once secondary, may take on greater importance. Traps, snares, and other methods that require less energy than active pursuit may become more attractive, though evidence for such techniques is often indirect. Materials themselves begin to matter differently. Stone suitable for toolmaking may no longer be easily accessible in regions where people are forced to travel different routes. This can lead to more careful use of available material, more repair, more reuse. A broken tool may not be discarded if replacement is uncertain. Instead, it may be reshaped, reduced, given a second life in a different form. This attention to material extends beyond stone, bone, wood. Plant fibers all become part of a system in which nothing is casually wasted because everything requires effort to obtain. Clothing, though rarely preserved in early archaeological contexts, likely changes in response to harsher conditions as well. A drying world is not only about heat, it often brings greater temperature extremes, with hot days and cold nights, protection from sun, wind, and cold becomes more important, especially during long movements between reliable shelters. The ability to carry water, to protect the body, to endure exposure, these are not separate concerns. They are part of a single system of adaptation that allows humans to operate within a landscape that no longer supports them easily. Perhaps most importantly, planning itself becomes a kind of tool. In a stable environment, planning exists, but it is often anchored in reliable cycles. In an unstable one, planning must account for variation and failure. Routes are chosen with alternatives in mind. Camps are placed with escape in mind. Resources are used with awareness of what may come next. This kind of forward thinking does not require abstract theory, but it does require a shift in emphasis. The present is no longer sufficient as a guide. The near future must be imagined, compared, and prepared for in ways that were less urgent before. Scholars still debate how far these cognitive shifts go and how directly they can be tied to environmental stress, but it is difficult to ignore the alignment. A world that becomes less predictable places a premium on anticipating change. It rewards those who can imagine not only what is, but what might be. This does not mean that people suddenly become different beings. It means that certain traits, foresight, patience, adaptability become more valuable, more necessary, and perhaps more deeply embedded in how life is organized. These changes do not happen everywhere in the same way. Some regions may retain enough stability to support older patterns for longer. Others may experience sharper, more immediate pressure. Human responses vary accordingly. There is no single path from abundance to scarcity, and no single set of tools that define survival. But across these variations, a common theme emerges. The desert does not simply strip away options, it forces refinement. It demands that people become more efficient, more deliberate, more attentive to the relationship between effort and return. And yet, even as tools improve and strategies sharpen, there are limits. No amount of refinement can fully compensate for a landscape that continues to lose its capacity to support life. Tools can extend survival. They can make difficult conditions manageable for longer. They can open new possibilities within narrow constraints, but they cannot reverse the broader trend. The land is still changing. Water is still becoming less reliable. Corridors are still closing. Refuges are still shrinking. This creates a paradox. The better people become at surviving in a harsher environment, the longer they can remain within it. But remaining longer may also expose them to greater risk if the decline continues. Adaptation can delay departure, but it cannot always prevent it. The same skills that allow a group to endure may also make it harder to recognize when endurance is no longer enough. In this sense, tools are not just instruments of survival, they are part of a larger negotiation with the environment. They allow humans to push back against scarcity, to carve out space within a tightening world. But they also tie humans more closely to that world, investing time, knowledge, and identity in strategies that depend on conditions that may continue to deteriorate. The line between resilience and entrapment becomes thin. Still, these refinements matter. They are not failures. They are evidence of a species learning, adjusting, and persisting under pressure that would erase many others. The desert forces humans to become more than they were, not in a sudden leap, but through countless small decisions embedded in tools, techniques, and habits. Each sharpened edge, each improved method of processing food, each better way of carrying water or choosing a route, these are the quiet technologies of survival. By the time the sand fully dominates the landscape, much of this transformation has already taken place. The visible desert is only the final expression of a deeper process. The real change happens earlier, in the minds and hands of people who learn to live with less, to extract more from what remains, and to carry their knowledge across a world that is steadily withdrawing its generosity. The tools they leave behind are modest, a flake of stone, a worn grinding surface, a reshaped edge. But behind each of these objects lies a decision made under pressure, a refinement of practice, a step toward a way of life shaped not by abundance, but by the constant need to make a harder earth yield just enough to keep going. As the land tightens and the margin for error shrinks, survival stops being an individual achievement. It becomes something that must be shared, distributed, reinforced across people who depend on one another more than ever before. In a world where resources are uncertain and movement is costly, no single person can carry all the knowledge, strength, and adaptability required to endure. The desert does not simply pressure bodies, it pressures relationships, it tests how humans live together. In more forgiving environments, social bonds still matter. But there is room for distance, for independence, for looser ties that can be maintained without constant reinforcement. A drying world changes that balance. Cooperation becomes less optional, more structural. Not because people suddenly become more altruistic, but because isolation becomes increasingly dangerous. A lone individual, or even a small, poorly connected group, is far more vulnerable to miscalculation, injury, or simple bad luck when there are fewer second chances in the landscape. What begins to emerge under such conditions is a deeper reliance on shared knowledge. One person may know the location of a distant water source, another the seasonal behavior of a certain animal, another the preparation of a difficult plant, another the safest route through a narrow corridor of survival. No single mind holds everything. The group itself becomes a kind of living system, distributing expertise across its members. What survives in the record suggests that this kind of knowledge sharing is not incidental. It is essential, and as conditions grow harsher, the value of maintaining these connections increases. Kinship likely plays a central role in this process, though the exact structure of early human social systems remains a subject of ongoing debate. Blood ties, marriage alliances, and extended family networks create frameworks through which cooperation can be sustained over time. In a drying world, these frameworks may become more important, not less. They allow for the movement of individuals between groups, the sharing of resources in times of need. and the exchange of information across distances that no single group could cover alone. A person may leave one group and join another not only out of necessity, but as part of a broader system that keeps knowledge circulating. But cooperation is not simple harmony. It carries its own tensions. Sharing resources means reducing what is immediately available to oneself. Trust must be balanced against caution. Groups must decide when to open themselves to others and when to close ranks. The evidence remains incomplete, but what can be inferred from ethnographic parallels and archaeological patterns suggests that these decisions are rarely fixed. They shift with conditions. A group that shares in a relatively stable season may become more guarded in a harsher one. Alliances may strengthen under pressure, but they may also fracture when resources fall below a critical threshold. Teaching becomes one of the most important social functions in this environment. Knowledge is no longer something that can be left to chance transmission. It must be passed on with care, because the cost of ignorance is rising. Children must learn not only what to do, but when and why. They must understand the signs of a failing water source, the behavior of animals under stress, the preparation of marginal foods, the routes that remain viable and those that no longer do. This is not abstract education. It is survival instruction embedded in daily life. Mistakes are corrected quickly, sometimes harshly, because there is less room to learn slowly. This emphasis on teaching may also deepen the role of elders. In a changing world, long memory becomes both valuable and complicated. Elders carry knowledge of past conditions, including times when the land was more generous. They may remember routes, resources, and strategies that younger members have never experienced. This can be a strength, providing a wider perspective on environmental variability, but it can also create tension when past patterns no longer apply. Scholars still debate how such generational differences played out, but it is likely that authority became more dynamic, negotiated between experience and present necessity. There is also a growing need for coordination. Movement decisions affect everyone. Leaving too early or too late can have consequences for the entire group. Hunting strategies require timing and cooperation. Resource use must be balanced to avoid exhausting critical sites. In such a context, leadership, whether formal or informal, may become more significant, not in the sense of rigid hierarchy, but in the ability of certain individuals to influence group decisions based on knowledge, skill, or social standing. A drying world rewards those who can guide others through uncertainty, but it also exposes them to blame when decisions fail. Communication itself likely becomes more nuanced. Signals, gestures, shared understandings, and perhaps early forms of symbolic expression all play a role in conveying information that cannot be easily demonstrated. A warning about a distant water source, a memory of a failed route, a plan for movement across unfamiliar ground. These require more than immediate observation. They require the ability to represent absence, to talk about things not currently visible. Some scholars suggest that such pressures may have contributed to the development of more complex language and symbolic thinking, though this remains an area of active research and debate. The desert, in this sense, may not only shape how people live, but how they think about living together. It encourages a form of social intelligence that is attuned to interdependence. People must read not only the land, but each other. They must anticipate needs, recognize strengths, and manage conflict without allowing it to destroy the group. This does not mean that conflict disappears. It means that its management becomes more critical. A dispute that might have been tolerable in a richer environment can become catastrophic when it disrupts cooperation in a harsher one. There are also moments where cooperation extends beyond immediate groups. Seasonal gatherings at reliable water sources may bring different bands together, creating opportunities for exchange, mating, and the reinforcement of broader social networks. These gatherings, if they occurred, would have been shaped by both necessity and opportunity. They allow for the spread of information across wider regions, helping groups adjust to changing conditions beyond their immediate experience. At the same time, they introduce new dynamics of competition, negotiation, and cultural exchange. What survives in the archaeological record hints at these interactions through shared tool styles, overlapping occupation layers, and patterns of material distribution that suggest contact rather than isolation. But the full texture of these relationships is largely invisible. It must be inferred, pieced together from fragments that do not speak directly. Still, the logic of survival in a drying world strongly supports the idea that human groups become more connected in some ways, even as the landscape fragments around them. This paradox, fragmented land, intensified social connection, is one of the defining features of the desert's pressure. As physical pathways narrow, social pathways may need to widen. Information must travel further because resources do not. Alliances must reach beyond immediate kin because local options are limited. The human network stretches, even as the ecological network contracts. And within this network, culture begins to carry a heavier load. Stories, practices, shared norms, and remembered experiences all become tools for navigating uncertainty. They encode knowledge about the land, about behavior, about risk. They help coordinate action and maintain cohesion. They also provide a sense of continuity in a world where physical continuity is breaking down. The desert does not erase culture, it demands more of it. By this stage, survival is no longer just a matter of finding water and food. It is a matter of maintaining a system of relationships that can support those tasks over time. The group becomes the primary unit of adaptation, not just the individual. Success depends on how well people can work together, share knowledge, manage tension, and make decisions under pressure. The desert, enforcing these changes, leaves a legacy that extends far beyond its immediate boundaries. It shapes not only where people go, but how they organize themselves when they get there. It teaches lessons about cooperation, planning, and shared survival that will echo in later human societies, long after the specific conditions that produce them have changed. In the tightening grip of a drying world, humans do not simply endure, they reorganize. They become more deeply social, more reliant on one another, more aware that survival is not something achieved alone. And in that shift, something fundamental about human life is being forged, something that will persist even when the desert itself is left behind. The desert changes the mind long before anyone has words for such a change. It does not do so through mystery, but through repetition. The same pressures arrive again and again until thought itself begins to reorganize around them. A water source cannot simply be known. It must be remembered across absence. A route cannot simply be walked. It must be imagined before it is visible. A food source cannot simply be gathered. It must be anticipated, protected, delayed, and rationed through time. In a harder landscape, the mind is asked to live further ahead of the body than before. This is one of the quietest and most profound transformations in the whole story. Earlier, humans already plan, already remember, already cooperate. None of these capacities begins in the desert, but what a drying world appears to do is intensify their value. It rewards those who can think beyond the immediate scene, who can carry landscapes internally even when those landscapes are no longer in front of them, and who can act on what is not yet present, in a greener world. the visible environment provides more of the answer. In a harsher one, survival increasingly depends on the invisible remembered water, expected movement, predicted failure, imagined alternatives. To live in such a place is to become deeply familiar with absence. That may sound abstract, but in practical terms it is not abstract at all. It means knowing that what matters most is often not here. The next reliable spring lies beyond the horizon. The better grazing is 2 days away if the old route is still passable. The seed-bearing grasses ripen only after a certain sequence of weather. The people who might share news of a surviving refuge are not in camp yet, but may arrive if the season has unfolded in the old pattern, or perhaps they will not. A drying landscape teaches humans to orient themselves toward missing things. Memory and imagination stop being luxuries of thought. They become tools of survival. This may be where foresight hardens into everyday discipline. In more forgiving settings, acting on the immediate world can carry a group a long way. In more unstable conditions, immediate appearances can become deceptive. A water source that looks sufficient may not last. A patch of vegetation that seems worth using may be a trap if it delays movement too long. A brief return of rain may not signal recovery, only interruption. Scholars still debate how directly such environmental stress can be linked to specific cognitive developments, and the evidence is necessarily indirect. No single explanation fully accounts for the growth of human foresight, symbolic reasoning, or complex planning. Yet it is difficult to ignore the pressure exerted by a world in which those traits repeatedly improve the odds of survival. Memory in this setting becomes more than recall. It becomes structured, weighted, and selective. Not every detail matters equally. People must remember what will matter later under stress: the taste of bad water, the smell of ground before rain, the shape of a hill that marks a hidden basin, the direction birds take at dusk when surface water is scarce, the sequence of landmarks between one refuge and another, the look of clouds that promise nothing. This is practical memory. But it also shapes attention. A person trained in such landscapes learns to notice weak signals and retain them because later they may become decisive. There is reason to think that teaching under these conditions would favour not just imitation, but explanation. A child can follow an adult to water, but that is not enough if future survival depends on recognising when the usual path has failed. To prepare another mind for a changing world requires more than showing. It requires conveying principles, comparisons, warnings, and exceptions. Not simply where to go, but how to judge. Not simply what to gather, but which signs mean it is too early, too late, too risky, too scarce. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the logic of adaptations strongly suggests that environments of uncertainty reward humans who can transmit flexible understanding rather than rigid habit. This may also be where abstraction grows more useful. To navigate a fluctuating landscape, one has to think in categories broader than the immediate object. Not this single pool, but the kind of ground where water lingers. Not this one herd, but the pattern by which animals respond to drying pasture. Not this year alone, but the difference between temporary hardship and a larger turn in conditions. Abstraction allows knowledge to travel from one setting to another. It turns experience into something portable. In a stable world, richly detailed local knowledge may be enough. In a changing one, the ability to generalize from experience becomes more valuable, because the next challenge will not look exactly like the last. The desert also alters time inside the mind. When resources are secure, time can be lived close to the present. There is still planning, but the near future tends to resemble the recent past closely enough that expectations hold. In a drying world, the future becomes less trustworthy and therefore more important. The next week, the next season, the next migration window, the next water point on the route, these all press more heavily on thought. Delay becomes dangerous. Timing becomes moral in the sense that a bad decision can affect others, not just oneself. One leaves not when a place has failed completely, but when judgment says it is about to. This is a subtle but consequential shift. It means that survival favors those who can treat the future as real before it arrives. This ability to act on what is not yet visible may help explain why humans prove so resilient in such punishing conditions. The desert does not make people stronger in the simple physical sense. It makes strength less sufficient on its own. Stamina matters, certainly. So do toughness and tolerance. But again and again the harsher landscape elevates another set of capacities: anticipation, restraint, comparison, delayed reward, strategic movement, and the ability to hold multiple possibilities at once. A person may need to keep walking toward a water source that might be dry, while preserving enough energy to change course if signs along the way suggest failure. That is not just endurance, it is conditional thinking under stress. Some scholars have suggested that environments of scarcity and unpredictability may also intensify symbolic behavior. This remains contested, and the desert is never the sole cause of anything so large. Still, the connection is worth considering carefully. Symbols allow absent things to be represented. They allow knowledge to be stored outside immediate perception, whether in marks, objects, stories, gestures, or repeated forms. A landscape organized by absence and delayed outcomes might well favor minds increasingly comfortable with representation, not because symbols are decorative, but because they help bridge the gap between the seen and the needed. The debate remains open, and the archaeological record rarely offers simple answers. Yet the broader point stands: a changing desert makes invisible information more important. And invisible information is exactly what human symbolic capacities are unusually good at managing. There is also the mental discipline of restraint. In a dwindling world, survival often depends on not doing what the body wants most immediately, not drinking too much at the first source if the next stretch is uncertain, not consuming all gathered food in the comfort of a rare, successful day, not staying too long in a place that still offers something if signs suggest it will soon offer nothing. This kind of restraint can be taught socially, but it must also be internalized. Over time, it may become part of character, the habit, and expectation. The desert favors not only those who know, but those who can obey what they know when appetite and fatigue argue otherwise. The mind adapts, then, not by becoming detached from the environment, but by becoming more deeply entangled with it in delayed form. One thinks farther because the land has become less immediately generous. One remembers more because forgetting now kills faster. One imagines alternatives because the known route may already be failing. One compares subtle signs because certainty has withdrawn. No single piece of evidence can show this process entire, but the shape of it fits the pressures preserved across the record. A desert in formation does not merely remove resources, it changes what kinds of attention pay off. And this has consequences beyond the desert itself. Once such habits of thought are developed, they do not vanish the moment a group reaches easier ground. Portable memory remains useful. Coordinated planning remains useful. Symbolic communication, delayed consumption, strategic movement, and the ability to model absent conditions remain useful. In this sense, the desert may act less as a local hardship than as a training ground for capacities that later travel widely with human populations. It selects for minds that can survive uncertainty, and uncertainty, of course, is never confined to one place. There is something almost paradoxical in this. The desert strips away immediacy, yet in doing so it may deepen imagination. It removes abundance, yet it makes thought itself richer in structure, because more must be carried mentally. It imposes absence, yet it increases the value of representing what is absent accurately and acting on it in time. A greener world may nourish the body more easily, a harsher one may demand more from the mind. By now the transformation is no longer just visible in movement, tools, and social ties. It is settling into perception, judgment, and expectation. The land has become harder to read, and so humans become more interpretive creatures. They learn to treat silence, distance, delay, and faintness as meaningful. They learn that survival depends not only on what is present, but on what can be inferred from traces, remembered from experience, and imagined before it is encountered. The desert does not create the human mind from nothing, but it may sharpen some of its most important edges, and in that sharpening lies one of the deepest ways this harsh landscape forces humans to change forever, not only by making them move, or work, or cooperate differently, but by teaching them to live intelligently inside uncertainty, where the world that matters most is often the one not yet seen. What remains of this transformation is scattered, buried, and often silent. The desert does not preserve stories in any direct way. It erases as much as it reveals. Wind lifts away surface traces. Sand buries entire landscapes. Water, when it briefly returns, reshapes what little survives. And yet, beneath this shifting surface, there are records fragmented, indirect, but persistent enough that, when assembled carefully, they begin to outline the long struggle between humans and a drying world. One of the clearest archives lies in the ground itself. Ancient lake beds, now hardened and cracked, hold layers of sediment that capture the memory of water. Within these layers are tiny particles, pollen grains, mineral deposits, traces of algae that record the presence or absence of vegetation, the chemistry of water, the rhythm of wet and dry phases. These records do not speak in words, but they speak in patterns. They show that regions now dominated by desert once held stable water bodies for extended periods, and that these bodies did not vanish suddenly. They fluctuated, shrank, recovered briefly, and then retreated again, leaving behind a layered history of decline. Along the edges of these former lakes, archaeologists find tools, not in neat arrangements, not in preserved settlements with clear boundaries, but scattered in ways that suggest repeated human presence. Stone flakes, broken implements, grinding surfaces worn smooth by long use. These objects are small, but they carry weight. They indicate that people return to these places again and again, even as conditions worsened. They suggest persistence, adaptation, and perhaps hesitation, the unwillingness to abandon a resource until it was no longer viable at all. There are also bones, animal remains found far from any modern water source, sometimes belonging to species that could not survive in today's conditions, fish bones in dry basins, remains of grazing animals in areas now too barren to support them. These finds reinforce what the sediments already imply: the environment has shifted dramatically. But they also provide clues about human behavior: cut marks on bones, patterns of breakage. The selection of certain species over others all hint at how people adjusted their subsistence strategies as the landscape changed. In some regions, there are traces of more structured activity: hearths, clusters of tools, repeated occupation layers that suggest seasonal return. These are not permanent settlements in the later sense, but they are not random either. They indicate places of important sites where resources could still be relied upon long enough to justify repeated use. As the desert advances, these sites often show signs of increasing pressure. Occupation layers become thinner or more sporadic. The types of tools change. The evidence of certain food sources disappears. Eventually, many of these places fall silent altogether. One of the most striking forms of evidence comes from rock art. In parts of what is now desert, there are images carved or painted onto stone surfaces, animals, human figures, scenes that reflect a world very different from the present one. Cattle, giraffes, aquatic life, even boats in some cases. These images are not literal records in the way modern documentation might be, but they are powerful indicators of environmental conditions and human perception. They suggest a time when water was abundant enough to support not only survival, but expression. Yet even here, the record is complex. Rock art spans long periods, and its interpretation is not always straightforward. Some images may reflect memory rather than immediate reality. Others may carry symbolic meaning not directly tied to the environment. Scholars still debate the extent to which these depictions can be used as direct evidence of climate conditions. But taken together with geological and archaeological data, they contribute to a broader picture, a landscape that changed dramatically, and people who responded to that change in ways that left marks both practical and expressive. There are also more subtle traces, chemical signatures in soil that indicate prolonged dryness, isotopic analysis of animal teeth that reveals changes in diet and water sources over time, the distribution of stone tool materials, showing how far people travelled or traded to obtain suitable resources as local options diminished. Each of these lines of evidence is incomplete on its own, but when combined, they begin to form a network of inference, a way of reconstructing a past that was never written down. One of the challenges in interpreting this record is that absence itself becomes meaningful. When a site that was once occupied repeatedly shows no further evidence of use, it raises questions. Did people leave permanently? Did they shift to another nearby location? Did conditions become so harsh that survival was no longer possible there at all? The desert rarely answers these questions directly. It forces researchers to work with probabilities, with patterns rather than certainties. This uncertainty extends to the timing of events. Different regions dry at different rates. Some areas may experience prolonged stability before a rapid decline. Others may fluctuate for centuries before finally tipping into sustained aridity. Human responses are equally varied. Some groups may leave early, others late. Some may adapt in place for long periods, others may move quickly. No single timeline fits all cases, and scholars continue to refine their understanding as new evidence emerges. Despite these uncertainties, a general pattern is visible. There are phases of occupation, adaptation, intensification, and eventual abandonment. There are shifts in tool use, diet, and mobility. There are signs of increasing pressure around key resources, followed by dispersal or collapse of local populations. The desert does not erase these patterns completely. It preserves them in fragments, enough to suggest the shape of what occurred, even if the details remain elusive. One of the more surprising aspects of this record is how long people often remain in deteriorating environments. Even as conditions worsen, there is evidence of continued use of certain sites, continued reliance on shrinking resources. This persistence may reflect attachment, lack of alternatives, or the effectiveness of adaptation strategies that allow survival beyond what might be expected. it also suggests that the decision to leave is rarely simple. It is delayed, reconsidered, resisted, and only made when necessary. At the same time, there are clear signs of movement, the appearance of similar tool types in distant regions, the spread of certain cultural practices, the genetic signatures of populations found far from their likely origins all point to migration. These movements are not always directly traceable to specific environmental events, but the correlation is strong enough that the influence of climate cannot be ignored. What emerges from this scattered evidence is not a single narrative, but a mosaic, a world in transition, captured in pieces, lakes shrinking, tools changing, animals moving, people adapting, and eventually, in many places, leaving. The desert does not provide a complete story, but it provides enough to understand that something profound occurred. And perhaps the most important thing the record reveals is that this was not a brief episode. It unfolded over generations, even millennia. The people who lived through it did not experience it as a single crisis, but as a long series of adjustments. The desert did not arrive overnight. It grew, slowly and persistently, shaping behavior, movement, and thought long before it fully dominated the landscape. In this sense, the evidence beneath the sand is not just a record of environmental change, it is a record of human response. It shows how people continued to live, adapt, and move within a world that was becoming increasingly difficult. It shows resilience, but also limits. It shows ingenuity, but also loss. The desert keeps these traces not out of intention, but by accident. It buries them, preserves them, and sometimes reveals them again. And when they are found, they offer glimpses into a past where the stakes of survival were written not in documents or monuments, but in the quiet persistence of people who learned to read a changing world and respond to it, step by step, until the landscape itself forced them to become something new. For all the evidence buried beneath the sand, for all the shorelines, tools, bones, and fading traces of repeated human return, the story is still full of argument. The desert preserves clues, but it does not preserve certainty. It offers patterns clear enough to be compelling, and gaps wide enough to remain unsettling. Scholars can see that wetter worlds existed where arid ones now dominate. They can see that humans occupied those worlds, adapted as they dried, and in many cases moved when the pressure became too great. But how exactly these transformations unfolded, how quickly, how unevenly, and how decisively they shaped human development remains a matter of continuing debate. One of the first difficulties lies in timing. Drying is not a single event. It is a process that pulses, retreats, returns, and advances differently across regions. A lake in one basin may be shrinking while another, not impossibly far away, remains productive for generations longer. A corridor that seems open at one moment may close, then briefly reopen, then fail decisively. This makes chronology hard to pin down in human terms. Geological records can identify broader climatic phases, but connecting those phases to specific human decisions is another matter entirely. A dry period may last centuries. A migration may occur within a generation. The scales do not match neatly. What survives in the record suggests overlap, pressure, and repeated adjustment. But the exact sequence of cause and response often remains blurred. This blurring matters because it shapes every larger interpretation. Did certain groups leave early because they recognized a permanent shift, or because a local crisis forced immediate movement? Did others remain because conditions were genuinely manageable in their refuge? or because attachment and inherited expectation delayed departure. The evidence rarely allows such questions to be settled cleanly. Archaeology is often asked to reconstruct motives from objects and sediments, and motives are among the first things to disappear. A grinding stone can tell us that people processed food. It cannot tell us whether they felt resilient, trapped, hopeful, or exhausted while doing it. A final occupation layer can suggest abandonment. It cannot explain whether the departure was strategic, desperate, or temporary. There is also the question of climate's real weight in the story. Climate clearly matters. No serious reading of the evidence can ignore how strongly rainfall, vegetation, and water availability shape where humans and animals can live. But climate does not operate alone. The temptation to treat environmental change as a kind of master key is strong because it gives the story an elegant structure. The rains fail, the land dries, people change. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the actual complexity of human response. Geography complicates everything. A slight decline in rainfall affects a deep river valley differently than it affects an exposed basin. Local ecology matters. Social networks matter. Technologies matter. Population density matters. Two communities facing similar environmental stress may respond in radically different ways because their options, relationships, and inherited knowledge are not the same. This is why scholars often argue not over whether climate mattered, but over how much explanatory power it should be granted. Some see environmental pressure as the dominant force, the great organizer that restructures movement, subsistence, and perhaps even cognition. Others are more cautious, emphasizing that human beings are not passive surfaces onto which climate simply writes outcomes. They improvise, they negotiate, they delay. They persist in places that models might predict they should have abandoned sooner. They sometimes move for reasons that are only partly environmental, drawn by opportunity as much as pushed by loss. The tension between these interpretations is not trivial. It affects how we imagine ancient people themselves as populations swept along by planetary change, or as agents continually making difficult choices inside it. Migration routes, too, remain intensely debated. In regions like North Africa and Arabia, the question is not only whether greener corridors existed, but how consistently they could be used, by whom, and at what moments. A corridor visible in paleoclimate models may not have been equally practical for actual human movement. Water might have been seasonally available but dangerously sparse between key points. Predators, disease, rough terrain, and competition from other groups could all turn a theoretical path into a highly selective one. Genetic evidence sometimes suggests movement that archaeology has not yet fully mapped. Archaeology sometimes suggests opportunities that genetics complicates. The evidence does not always align neatly, and scholars still debate whether major dispersals were concentrated in a few favourable windows or spread across repeated waves over long spans of time. Then there is the issue of survival itself. When we say that the desert forced humans to change, what exactly does that mean? It may mean that some populations adapted in place, learning to survive with less, refining tools and social structures as conditions worsened. It may mean that others left, taking their skills into new landscapes and in that sense changing because movement demanded it. It may also mean that some groups simply disappeared from certain regions, their lines ending locally even if the species continued elsewhere. These are very different kinds of change, and the record does not always let us distinguish them confidently. An empty site may mean abandonment. It may also mean that evidence has not yet been found nearby, or that later erosion removed it, or that occupation became lighter and less archaeologically visible. Absence, once again, is suggestive but not straightforward. The role of cognition is another area where caution becomes essential. It is tempting to draw a clean line between environmental instability and the sharpening of planning, memory, symbolic thought, or cooperation. The logic is persuasive. A harder world rewards foresight. A more fragmented landscape increases the value of shared knowledge. A life organized around distant resources encourages abstraction and delayed decision-making. But proving such relationships is far harder than proposing them. Human cognition evolves across immense spans of time and under many pressures at once. Social complexity, language, tool-making, child-rearing, mobility, predation, and sheer demographic history all play their part. Scholars still debate how much environmental hardship can be said to accelerate these traits, and how much it merely reveals capacities already in motion. The desert may not create such abilities, but it may amplify the advantage of those who possess them. Even that more cautious formulation remains partly inferential. There are also debates over scale. Some researchers emphasize continental or even planetary mechanisms, orbital cycles, monsoon shifts, atmospheric feedbacks, large-scale vegetation change. Others focus on microregions, arguing that what mattered most for human life was not the average climate across a vast zone, but the local pattern of springs, soils, shade, fauna, and terrain. Both perspectives are necessary, and they do not always sit comfortably together. A broad climatic trend may be unmistakable while local experience remains wildly uneven. This can produce two different stories from the same evidence, one of sweeping environmental transformation and one of patchy, contingent survival. Both are true in part, neither is complete on its own. The disputed role of refugees adds another layer. Were these pockets of remaining habitability mainly temporary shelters that delayed inevitable migration? Or were they creative zones where knowledge intensified, alliances formed, and new forms of adaptation emerged? The answer may be both, depending on the region and the moment. A refuge can preserve life, but it can also compress competition. It can nurture cultural continuity, but also trap people when the wider routes close. Some scholars see refuges as engines of innovation under pressure. Others emphasize their fragility and the demographic bottlenecks they may impose. The evidence remains too fragmentary for any single model to dominate every case. Even the concept of the desert can be misleading if treated too simply. Deserts are not uniform, and desertification is not the same everywhere. One area may become dune-dominated, another may retain stony plateaus, scattered vegetation, and usable seasonal paths. Some regions oscillate between less and more severe aridity across long spans, creating recurrent opportunities for movement rather than a single irreversible shift. This matters because language can harden imagination. To say a place became desert is true in one sense, but it may obscure the lived reality of transitional environments that remained partly usable, intermittently inviting, and difficult to classify. Ancient people did not step from a green world directly into endless sterile sand. More often, they inhabited the long, uncertain middle. And then there are the popular theories, the ones that gather attention because they promise simplicity or drama. Vast forgotten civilizations supposedly swallowed whole by sand. Sudden cataclysms wiping populations out overnight. Hidden advanced cultures fleeing desiccation and seeding later societies in secret. These ideas persist because deserts invite projection. Their emptiness seems to ask for lost empires. But mainstream archaeology and paleoclimate research offer a more demanding and more convincing picture, not a vanished golden age erased in one stroke. but a drawn-out environmental transformation shaping many different communities in many different ways. The truth is slower, less theatrical, and far more revealing about what human adaptation actually looks like. What all these debates share is an underlying humility before the record. Scholars can identify strong patterns, but the evidence remains incomplete. New cores, new excavations, new dating methods, and new genetic analyses continue to refine the picture, sometimes dramatically. Places once thought marginal turn out to have been occupied much more intensively. Assumed migration routes become more complicated. Timelines shift. Old arguments are narrowed, revised, or reopened. The desert story is not closed, it is still being assembled. And perhaps that incompleteness is part of the subject rather than a defect in it. A drying world does not produce clean archives. It produces fragments, interruptions, misalignments, and traces that survive only by accident. The uncertainty surrounding these ancient changes is, in its own way, faithful to the experience of living through them. The people involved did not enjoy clarity either. They too moved through partial evidence, weak signals, temporary recoveries, and irreversible thresholds they could only recognize fully after crossing them. Scholars, reading what remains, are trying to do something similar in reverse. So the debate continues, not because nothing is known, but because enough is known to make the unanswered questions more interesting. Climate matters, but not alone. Migration happened, but not in a single wave. Adaptation was real, but so were limits. Cognition may have been sharpened by scarcity, but it was not shaped by scarcity only. Refuges preserved life, but also magnified risk. The desert forced change, but the forms of that change were multiple, uneven, and deeply human. If the earlier sections of this story trace a tightening world, this one reveals something equally important: that the deeper the evidence is examined, the less the past behaves like a simple lesson. It resists reduction, it insists on complication, and in that complication, it preserves a more honest image of ancient humanity, not as symbols in an environmental theory, but as real populations facing a world that changed around them in ways they could never fully predict, and answering it with every mixture of intelligence, hesitation, courage, and uncertainty that still defines humans now. If the desert is understood only as destruction, then the deeper pattern is missed. It does destroy. It empties lakes, breaks corridors, strips vegetation, and forces people out of places that once sustained them. But destruction is only part of its force. The more unsettling possibility is that prolonged aridity does not merely eliminate ways of life, it also selects among them. It puts pressure on bodies, habits, minds, and relationships in ways that may favor some traits over others. Not once, not cleanly, but over long spans through repeated crisis. In that sense, the desert becomes more than a backdrop to human adaptation. It becomes one of the environments in which adaptation is continuously tested. This idea has to be handled carefully. Scholars are rightly wary of telling simplistic evolutionary stories in which one harsh landscape magically produces intelligence, cooperation, or modern humanity by itself. No single explanation fully accounts for changes as large as these. Human evolution and human behavioral development unfold across many environments, many pressures, and vast stretches of time: forest margins, coastlines, river valleys, uplands, predators, disease, tool use, fire. Child rearing and social competition all matter. The desert is not the sole author of anything, but that caution should not lead too quickly to dismissal. Extreme dryness does impose a particular kind of pressure, and the qualities it rewards are not trivial. What sort of pressure is it first? It is selective in terms of judgment. In a more generous landscape, poor decisions may be survivable more often. A group can recover from staying too long, moving too late, or wasting effort because the environment still holds enough redundancy to absorb mistakes. In a drying world, the same mistakes become more expensive. This means that decision quality timing, route choice, resource management, social coordination matters more intensely, over generations. Environments like this may not produce new human capacities from nothing, but they can certainly magnify the advantage of people and groups who are especially good at using the capacities they already possess. It is also selective in terms of patience. Scarcity rewards those who can delay consumption, conserve strength, and act according to future need rather than present relief. The body wants immediacy. It wants to drink deeply when water appears, rest when shelter is found. Remain in a place that still offers something rather than gamble on what lies beyond it. Yet a harsher world often punishes that instinct. Survival increasingly depends on restraint. Leave before comfort turns to danger. Save part of what has been gained. Continue walking while there is still enough strength to reach the next refuge. These are behavioral disciplines, but they are so closely tied to survival that it is difficult not to see them as evolutionary pressures in at least a broad sense. Then there is cooperation. Much earlier in human history, social life is already central. People are not transformed from solitary creatures into communal ones by aridity, but harsh dryness changes the cost of social failure. A fractured group, a broken alliance, poor transmission of knowledge, or unresolved tension can become deadly far faster when the landscape offers fewer corrections. In such conditions, cooperation is not merely beneficial. It can become one of the main filters through which survival is decided. This does not mean all groups become peaceful. Sometimes scarcity sharpens violence, but it does mean that the ability to maintain functional bonds, however tense or conditional, carries greater value. Memory, too, comes under pressure in a way that may be unusually intense. A wetland world still rewards remembering where good places are. A drying world demands remembering which places fail last, which routes remain viable under worsening conditions, which temporary signs should be trusted, and which should be treated as dangerous illusions. The memory that matters here is not nostalgic, it is operational, and because the landscape is changing, memory alone is not enough. It has to be paired with comparison and revision. The old map must be retained, but not obeyed blindly. A group that survives may be one that can preserve inherited knowledge while also updating it without sentiment. That balance between continuity and correction looks less like simple tradition and more like cognitive flexibility under pressure. This is where the desert begins to resemble an evolutionary training ground, not because it teaches in any conscious sense, but because it repeatedly exposes the consequences of different kinds of behavior. A population that can read weak signals, coordinate movement, share information, and avoid fatal overcommitment to failing ground may endure where another does not. A group that manages water more carefully moves before crisis peaks, and teaches children effectively may persist long enough to pass on both genes and culture. In this framework, environmental pressure is not only weeding out the physically weak, it is sorting through suites of behavior that interact with survival in a harsher world. Of course, this sorting is messy. People do not live in laboratory conditions. They intermarry, split, merge, imitate, borrow, and survive partly through luck. A group may make excellent decisions and still be destroyed by a sequence of failed reigns. Another may survive a little longer because its refuge holds unexpectedly. Scholars still debate how directly such environmental filters can be connected to biological evolution, rather than cultural adaptation alone. The two are intertwined in humans more than in almost any other species. We survive not just through bodies, but through learned behavior, tools, social systems, and inherited knowledge. That means the desert may act most strongly not on anatomy in the narrow sense, but on the combined system of body, mind, and culture. Yet even if we remain cautious, the implications are striking. A harsh, dry environment likely favours traits that later become central to human expansion into many other uncertain worlds. Planning ahead, managing scarcity, moving strategically, communicating about absent conditions, forming reliable social ties across distance, teaching flexible skills rather than rigid routines. None of these are useful only in the desert. They are portable advantages. Once strengthened, they travel. A population shaped by repeated arid stress does not leave those capacities behind when it reaches a river valley, coastline, or grassland. It arrives carrying a more disciplined way of dealing with uncertainty. This may be one reason the consequences of desertification extend so far beyond the boundaries of the desert itself. The people pushed through these pressures do not emerge unchanged and then vanish into easier landscapes. They enter new regions having already been selected, culturally and perhaps in some deeper evolutionary sense, by a world that demanded unusual foresight and restraint. The desert, then, is not only a local ordeal. It becomes part of a much wider human story by preparing people for instability elsewhere. There is also the matter of bottlenecks. When habitable zones shrink, populations can become concentrated into refuges or forced along narrow movement corridors. This concentration may reduce numbers, limit mating networks, and intensify selection pressures. Such bottlenecks are often invoked in discussions of human evolution, though their exact timing and significance remain contested. The evidence is complicated, and no single bottleneck can be neatly tied to every major change in human history. Still, drying environments clearly have the capacity to fragment populations, isolate some groups, and force others into repeated contact. In that sense, they help shape not only who survives, but who mixes, who separates, and where new combinations of people and knowledge emerge. But because the margins narrowed beyond what any skill could overcome. To say that dryness exerts evolutionary pressure is not to say that it improves everyone it touches. It means only that it changes the terms of survival in ways that ripple through generations.